Hey, we're talking about unique places in Mississippi this week. Got another one for you here. In Jackson, Mississippi, there's a museum dedicated to showcasing Muslim culture. And it's the first such museum in North America, which obviously would make that kind of unique to Mississippi as well as the nation. It was the dream of a couple of people back in 2001 that it'd be a good idea maybe to let the world know the contributions that Muslims have made. And how that museum wound up in Jackson, Mississippi is what we're about to find out.
We have a museum in the city of Jackson, Mississippi, which has a twofold purpose, both to educate about Islam, but also to educate about all religious traditions. There's no just one form of Islam, just like there's no one form of Christianity.
I talked with folks at the museum and was pretty impressed by the good work that they were doing. They're really committed to making a difference in this community. The unfortunate thing, though, is I think that things like ISIS end up getting more attention than some of the work that we see being done by people like the International Museum for Muslim Culture.
It was never our vision that this will be turned into a full-time museum. Back in 2000, the city of Jackson hosted international exhibitions that used to come to Jackson every 2 years. At that time, there's an exhibit called Majesty of Spain, featuring primarily Spanish art from the 1700s.
This exhibition was a major international exhibition promoted to be probably the #1 must-see exhibition across the country. We just thought that, okay, they're going to be doing something on the Islamic contributions of Spain, but as it got closer, we learned that, of course, they weren't going to be doing anything.
So the Muslim community in Jackson, which is relatively small, actually decided to get a group together and begin to plan a companion exhibit called Islamic Moorish Spain, Its Legacy to Europe and the West. So we started the planning in late 2000, and actually we were open to the public concurrently with the Majesty of Spain in April of 2001.
We got a good number, about 25,000 of their visitors came to our exhibition, and they said to us, what you have is more substantive than what they have there, and we got a lot of encouragement. We were just going to do an exhibition. We weren't going to do a museum. We were just going to do the exhibition, close the exhibition, and be through with it. But of course, September the 11th happened.
The Muslim community in the United States is relatively small. I mean, we are a minority group, probably around 2 to 3%. The population of the Muslims in America range from 7 to 10 million people. So really a lot of our neighbors and friends and colleagues don't know many Muslim Americans. So a lot of times when people don't know each other, this creates an anxiety, and particularly after the events of September 11th.
When September 11th happened, we just expected that we were going to have to close the doors then. We came to the museum the next day. We had a brick had been thrown in our glass window, so we just, were really, really concerned about that. But what happened was that we got support from the interfaith community. We got educators that brought their students to the museum. We actually had a group that organized a press conference, telling people in Mississippi, in the Jackson area, that they stood with the Muslims, that they really didn't want any harm to come to the Muslims. So really that gave us a thrust to go on and stay.
We discovered as part of this process that there is not a single institution in the country that focuses on Islamic history and culture. So a lot of our supporters encouraged us basically to turn this exhibit into a full-time museum. So as a result of this, the International Museum of Muslim Cultures was born as the first Islamic history and culture museum in the country, focusing primarily on educating the American public about Islamic history and culture. Since then, until now, with a lot of the issues of terrorism, violence, extremism, there's a lot of tension between Muslim Americans and the larger community. And every time, in our opinion, what bridges the gap of misunderstanding is the issue of education.
I definitely believe that the museum helps to counteract some of the Islamophobia that we see around here and throughout the country and throughout much of the world, to be honest. I was reading a story recently that showed that a greater percentage of Americans have a negative opinion of Islam than there are percentage of Americans who have ever met a Muslim. So what that means is a lot of people have a negative view of Islam and a negative view of Muslims who have not ever actually met a Muslim. And so one of the things that the museum is doing is helping to counteract some of these negative stereotypes by showing that Islam means different things to different people, just like any religion does. To be a Christian doesn't mean the same thing to one person as it does to another necessarily. Similarly with Islam, it doesn't have to represent the negative values that are often reflected on TV and some of the worst news stories that we see.
We provided a place for educators, for students, for just the general public to come and learn more about the Muslim culture as opposed to depending on what they read about in the news. So you can actually come here and take your time educating yourself on Islamic culture, what it is and what it isn't, and you can get more accurate information. You get a chance to talk to Muslims directly and ask any question you like, and we'll be happy to, if we can't answer the question, you can always use our library, or we can get that information for you and assist you in any way we can.
We have a particular verse in the Quran that states there is no compulsion in religion, that we don't force anyone to become Muslim. We don't subject them to our religion. We simply just educate if asked.
Some people think that the museum has some kind of Islamic agenda. Really what it's trying to do is to enlighten people about the history of Africa, the history of Mississippi, the history of Islam, and to show how all of those are connected. Because not a lot of folks in the United States know that Islam is part of America's history. Muslims were, in the U.S. long before we even had a constitution. Because so many of the Africans who were enslaved came from predominantly Muslim parts of Africa, it was these enslaved Africans who actually built the southern colonies.
Historians say that 2/3 of the enslaved Africans that were brought to the Americas were Muslim. So part of the social fabric of America is to understand that Muslims are a part of what actually created America.
The impact of those enslaved Muslims, the contributions that they brought here, like music, for example, America's original music, the blues sound actually was brought over not only by Africans, that's kind of been, that's been known for a while, but there's a recent study that now has established that original blues sound actually came from the Muslim call to prayer.
We wouldn't have the blues without the Muslim call to prayer, right? So that whole music style comes out of Islam. We have, many, many different cultural connections. And actually, at one point, there were probably as many Muslims living in Mississippi as there were Christians. Because if you count all of the enslaved Africans who were Muslim but not allowed to practice their faith, they probably equaled many of what we would consider practicing Christians at that time. So this idea that religious diversity is a new thing to the United States history and to America is simply factually wrong, and part of the work of the museum is to dig back several centuries and show that we've been a pluralistic country ethnically, religiously, culturally, right from the very, very beginning. And that to say that Muslims don't belong in the United States is basically to ignore the history of the South and the history of Mississippi itself, which is a living witness to how long Islam has been part of the United States.